Hey, good afternoon. This is Antigone Payton, and I'm joined by Jennifer Atkins. We are part of the Decoding IP team at Protorae Law. Thanks for joining us. We are talking on these live streams about interesting issues in the news and some IP aspects to those issues. We talk about the hype. We talk about the real IP issues sitting in the background. So thanks for joining us. We have a really interesting topic today. Unless you've been under a rock, you've probably been seeing a lot of information about a big fight between a hedge fund and an artist who engages in guerrilla sculpture warfare. So this time we're going to talk about Charging Bull and Fearless Girl. So Jennifer, let's talk about Charging Bull and Fearless Girl. What are these sculptures and what's going on?
Absolutely. And it's funny that you said unless you've been under a rock, because that is literally the construction that I was going to use to start talking about this. So unless you've been hiding under a rock, as Antigone said, you know that back in March, in celebration of the 1-year anniversary of its index fund that is specific to gender diversity in corporate leadership, State Street Global Partners had commissioned a statue that they called Fearless Girl. And there it is, the picture of Fearless Girl. They commissioned this statue and got permits from New York in order to place it in proximity to another work. The sculpture itself was done by an ad agency, and it has a plaque on it that says, "Know the power of women in leadership. She makes a difference." And she, SHE, is the ticker symbol for the index fund that State Street Global uses for this to promote gender diversity in leadership. And the idea is that that index fund invests only in companies that have high scores on gender diversity in their leadership. So they commissioned this sculpture. She's a proud little girl standing there with her pigtails facing the wind. And what she is facing is another work of art. The work of art that she is facing is called the Charging Bull. It is a piece of art and sculpture that has been in this location in New York. Actually, it started off in another location and then was moved here. There it is, Charging Bull. It's a work of art by Arturo de Modica. Hi, Savannah. Nice to see you joining. We're talking about the Charging Bull. So this artist, if you remember, as I do, back in the 1980s, late 1980s, we had a stock market crash in 1987. In 1989, in the middle of the night, Arturo de Modica put this statue of a charging bull out in New York City in the financial district. And to him, it symbolized the robustness of the recovery, right? That America's economy was strong, that we came raging back like a charging bull. It was not permitted. It was guerrilla art, as you said. And there it was in New York. Eventually, it was moved. The city decided to have it stay. The artist still retains the title to the work, but it is on the New York public street. And so this Fearless Girl statue, probably the marketing firm's most successful moment of the year thus far, absolutely went globally viral. I mean, people were taking selfies with this little girl. It hit everything. It came, just after the defeat of Hillary Clinton in the election. It came after the Women's March. It was kind of this time in the country where lots of people were paying attention to women and women's issues. And there she is, this girl defiantly standing down the Charging Bull there in New York. It made headlines, went all over. And the message that people really talked about and that the conversation surrounded was, sort of women taking on Wall Street, that the symbolism there is not the Charging Bull. Sorry, the dog here is not the Charging Bull, being a symbol of a robust economy. It is the Charging Bull basically being part of something a little more nefarious, right? Like that we have to fight against as women. And this kind of upset the author or the artist, of the Charging Bull statue.
So Jennifer, one thing we should note here is this artist is very particular about his art. And this is not the first time that there's been a kerfuffle about his art and how it's displayed. He's had a couple of other situations where he's raised a public concern about his art and where it's located and how it's been used.
Yeah.
But that actually gets to a question about what his rights are. So his lawyers, his New York lawyers wrote a letter, which is now available on the internet for everybody to see. And they said, look, he's got trademark rights in this sculpture. He has copyright rights, and you're appropriating his rights, and you can't do this. Get the girl out of there, right? And they're also talking about this concept of moral rights, and probably a lot of creators in the United States don't understand what moral rights are, because frankly, to be perfectly honest, we say we have moral rights here, but we don't.
Yeah, that's right.
We pretend we have moral rights. We have a statute that's supposed to cover moral rights, but it's much more limited in what it protects in the United States. We did it so that we could get the benefit of some international copyright treaties. We had to have our own form of moral rights, but it's much more robust in France and particularly other European countries. But he's trying to make a real moral rights argument here. And he's making a couple other arguments relating to the fact that the Fearless Girl has completely changed the meaning of his artwork.
That's
but
right.
Let's talk about whether an artist gets to tell everybody what a work should mean and keep other artwork out of the same location because they think they alter the meaning.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here, right? So the first is, setting aside sort of being upset that Fearless Girl is taking more attention than your bull. What really are the rights that you're relying on? And so, one of the things that the lawyer said is, hey, by putting this girl here and by having part of her meaning be her relationship to this charging bull statue, you're actually creating a derivative work. And we've talked a lot in our live streams and podcasts and blogs about what a derivative work is or is not. That's sort of a very traditional copyright analysis. And then there's this second piece, right, where he makes this more moral rights argument. And for those who are watching who don't really understand what moral rights is, the idea is that you have the right as an artist to the integrity of your work, to your reputation as an artist, and to sort of this ephemeral idea that your work really is yours, even though it's kind of out in the world, and that you shouldn't have to suffer reputational damage by someone else's act. And as you said, Antigone, that's a lot more powerful in other places, and has been traditionally for a really long time. Back in 1990, though, Congress did amend the Copyright Act. They added Section 106A, which is our Visual Artists' Rights Act, to try to get at this moral rights concept. And what they said was, hey, if you're a visual artist, you have a right to attribution, right? So if you have a right for everyone to know that that sculpture is yours, you have a right to the integrity of the work and the integrity of your reputation. And then there's like a litany of exceptions, right?
Yeah, so let's get to the exceptions a second. So basically in the United States, the moral rights is limited to an intentional defacement, distortion, mutilation, or other modification of your artwork. So we're not talking about a situation, I think, with placement of other art near you, right? I mean, think about it this way. If I'm an artist, do I get to use moral rights to say, you can't put that picture of another impressionist artist next to mine because it alters the meaning of my 3 paintings that are a series? I don't want it in the same room. It changes the meaning. And it feels to me like this is a similar situation. To me, it doesn't really matter how close they are. It feels like what our Charging Bull artist is trying to do is really stretching the laws too far and trying to control the manner in which the work is displayed and it happens to be displayed outside next to another work.
I think that's right. I think this is definitely an issue where, should this eventually go to litigation, now it's just a very public spat. But should it go to litigation, this really would test the limits of VARA. There have not been a lot of VARA cases. There was one in Michigan, in Detroit, where there was a mural on a building, and someone bought the building and was intending to demolish it and put something else up. And the artist sued, saying, "You're going to destroy my artwork, and VARA protects my work from being destroyed." We don't know what the court ultimately would have done, because they ended up with a solution where the redevelopment would happen and the mural would get preserved. I would imagine that probably happens a fair amount. But there are some other cases that say, there was a case in a public park. I think it was in Illinois. It was somewhere in the Seventh Circuit, where there was a public park, and a sculptor had done these sculptures in it. And, 10, 15 years later, they wanted to redo some aspects of the park. The owner of the land wanted to redo some aspects. And the sculptor said, "Hey, no, under VARA, you can't do anything to my sculptures." And the Seventh Circuit kind of went both ways on VARA a little bit, and then said, well, even if VARA does protect your work, in this instance, sort of the overriding need to provide shade in the public park sort of trumps your moral rights, which just goes to prove the point that whether they exist or not, even when they do exist, they might be weak. I think there were some where the court said there's not even any protection, and some where said, well, even if there was, you don't have rights to a specific site for your work. And so the same thing could be said here, right? You move your bull.
Yeah, so this reminds me of Banksy. So Banksy is one of my favorite guerrilla artists, and obviously Banksy is world famous. But one of the things that happens whenever Banksy goes to a site is people will spray paint over it or take pieces. They'll sell them on a market, sort of back channels, and people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for Banksy art that used to be in the field, on the side of a building, on a door, things like that. And now it's put in another location. And that's just something that happens with Banksy art. But people know Banksy's brand, even though the artist is actually anonymous. So imagine if Banksy said, you can't touch it. It has to be exactly where I put it, as guerrilla art on the side of this abandoned building.
Right.
And imagine if moral arts in the United States, moral rights, meant that we couldn't tear down that building, right? The owner couldn't tear down that building because of the artist's moral rights. You can just imagine how strange this would be and how many issues this would create.
Right. And I think it's even more interesting in the case of guerrilla art, right? And particularly here, where the charging bull actually, was placed without permission in the first instance. And so the idea that I could go and say, well, now I've created this piece of art, you're no longer allowed to do anything to this building. Right. I mean, you sort of think of that from a guerrilla art perspective, like, wow, you could do a lot of damage with that. So I think the case law definitely sort of, I think, would probably go against finding moral rights to stop things like development of a building, or to stop things like redoing a park or things like that. Sorry, there's a lot of commotion here at my house. We just had a question on Facebook asking, how do we remember specific cases? We're nerds.
Plain and simple.
We're nerds. Sorry, this is what we do. This is basically a window into our daily conversations. Really, this live stream. This is the kind of stuff we talk about.
Jennifer, let's talk about the First Amendment issues here, because I think that's another interesting piece. Mm-hmm. So, we want people to be compensated for their art and to have certain rights. And so we have certain moral rights, we have copyright, we have trademark rights that can also protect certain types of arts. But how far do we go with that, right? Because, I lost my light.
You're not moving enough. Normally we're waving our hands around and doing all kinds of things so the lights don't go off on us, right?
That's my smart light.
Yeah.
So, but it's not very smart when I'm in here and quiet. So the First Amendment issues, right, I think are huge as well, because we want people to make statements with art. And so if I purchase a piece of art, let's put guerrilla art aside for a second, that just shows up somewhere. If I purchase a piece of art from an artist and I want to do something with that art in a public or a private location, shouldn't I be able to? We have a very strong set of First Amendment rights here in the United States, and there are not necessarily the same types of rights in other countries that have very strong moral rights. So I think we need to be balancing the rights of the artist to decide what happens with their work when they put it out into the world, against the ability to use art to make a statement that may not be what the artist originally intended.
I think that's right. And I think that's really why, our robust First Amendment and very, very strong tradition of freedom of speech probably gives you an indication of why it was so long before we had any doctrine really of moral rights in our copyright law, right? And it's not surprising that when we do have them, there's a ton of exceptions and they're kind of weak. Because you can, imagine meanings change over time too with art, and how we view art changes over time. And we were talking about this earlier, like what if I'm a museum curator and I want to create an exhibit that, questions a style of art or makes a point about, how this art that existed in this particular time period was, misogynistic or racist or whatever, right? Like when you're sort of trying to tell your history and trying to make a point and you do your exhibit, absolutely have the rights to do that. And then the question is, well, are you infringing on the moral rights of the artist by putting it in that kind of context?
Yeah, so we got an interesting question from Savannah, and she asked, what's the worst that could happen to somebody if they create art and put it in a public space, right?
Good question.
And authorized art. And there's a lot of interesting issues that can come up. I won't profess to be a criminal attorney, but it can be defacing public property depending upon what you do and how you do it. And depending upon the damage that's caused, that can be a misdemeanor or in some cases a felony. There's trespass if you put it on private property. There's other tort-like issues that can be associated with doing this with art. Now, frankly, I think with people like Banksy, people look the other way. But when people are doing, graffiti in areas where it's not wanted, and it has insults and slurs and things like that, in certain areas, the police really are cracking down to try to keep people from engaging in that kind of free speech, which is not the type of free speech that's normally protected by the First Amendment.
Yeah, we don't encourage you to do guerrilla public art, for particularly the kind that might be difficult to remove and might destroy things. Don't do that. But no, that's right. It would be a state and local, it would be a local jurisdiction issue in many ways, because most criminal law is an issue of state and local law. So
speaking of guerrilla art, do you remember before the election, somebody was putting statues of a naked Trump up all over the world?
That's right.
That again went viral, and nobody could figure out exactly. I haven't looked at the news lately to see if they figured out who that artist is, but I mean that's another perfect example of guerrilla art making a particular statement about a person, a public persona, and what they thought of the gentleman who's now the president of the United States. Right. I mean, guerrilla and public art definitely have their place. And public art, whether it's commissioned or not, it's an interesting part of our conversation, and it's something we want to continue to encourage as part of an open and free society.
Right. And so we got another question. I think this is leading to us to maybe a live stream on the First Amendment at some point, because someone said, well, who decides, what gets to be there? And the answer, the very, very, very short and not involved free speech answer is, local governments that have control of their parks get to decide what's in there. The First Amendment does allow time, place, and manner restrictions. Most jurisdictions, I know where I live in Alexandria, we have a pretty robust Arts Commission and Public Arts Fund and all of that kind of stuff that encourages public art. But it's a really interesting question, right, from a First Amendment standpoint, because it is public space. You should be able to say what you want, and to a large extent you can. But there are jurisdictions that decide whether to permit. We've got a public artist here in my neighborhood who does a lot of public art, and she usually gets permits.
So Jennifer, since you actually are involved in the planning commission there in Alexandria, and you've got your fingers in the fire on some of these issues, I'm just curious what you think about the type of art that had a different meaning back when it was installed. So let's think about Richmond, Virginia, and some of these famous generals, the statues that are in the middle of Monument Avenue, in other places around the country where, they were venerated people at the time. But because of where we are now culturally, and the divisiveness and the discussion about black on white crime and black on black crime and multiculturalism and its place in the world, people who were once celebrated by statutes, we're now having conversations about whether that sends the right message about that area and whether those statutes should be taken down.
Right. And this is
curious if you guys are having the same conversation in Alexandria and what you think about that.
We have had some of those conversations in Alexandria. We actually are prevented by the state from removing any of those statues. So it's really a state issue. I know my hometown of New Orleans has also had those conversations as well. But it's not just those. I mean, when you think about that and what they symbolize, what they meant at the time, what they might mean now, how they make people feel, certainly that's a public conversation about what do we want to have or not have in our city. But that actually brings up another point, which is, and getting a little bit back to our topic, which is, do artists have control over the meaning of their work, right? And so we talked at the beginning about one of the things that really irritated the artist in this case of Charging Bull was that he felt that this statue represented, American robustness, and that by the imposition of the fearless girl, it has now changed the meaning of that statue. But when you think about it, and the really famous example is the Statue of Liberty. So when the Statue of Liberty was gifted to the United States by France, it was meant to symbolize friendship between the two countries, right? That's what it was meant to symbolize. Over time, it came to mean so much more, and its meaning really, really changed. It really became more of a beacon to the world, more of a symbol of freedom and liberty in this country. It became a symbol of open immigration and allowing people to come here and change their lives. And so even something like the Statue of Liberty, the meaning of the piece of art has changed over time based on what we think and who we are and what it comes to symbolize. And so the notion that you could try to protect in copyright law the meaning, there she is, the Statue of Liberty, it's just sort of the antithesis in some ways of what we talk about really early and really often in copyright law, which is the idea expression dichotomy, right? We protect the expression, we protect the form of the Statue of Liberty. We don't let people copy that form. We protect that expression, but we don't protect the idea because ideas aren't somebody's property, right? And I think the same could really be extended to meaning. We might protect your bull and, we're not going to let people deface it and draw mustaches on it and whatever, but we don't protect and we don't tell people what it means, right? You can't control how people react to your artwork and the meaning that people take away from it. And so I think in terms of VARA and the moral rights, most courts would probably say, no, these are narrowly drawn to sort of protect from defacement and destruction and, and removal of attribution and stuff, as opposed to your ability to control what a piece of art means.
So Jennifer, we received a question about who gets to decide whether something is too offensive to be displayed as public art. And that's a really interesting question. I think it it's different for each place, right?
Yeah,
So
read the letters to the editor in the Alexandria papers.
right. So, it depends on whether we're talking about art that's being displayed at the Smithsonian or the Met or another location like that, or at a private gallery, versus whether it's art that's displayed in the public, right? And so sometimes it's if we're talking about publicly displayed art, sometimes it's the federal or the state level, depending on whether it's federal parkland or state land, or at the local level, right? So there's some group that's tasked with making these types of decisions. But lots of art is controversial, even if it doesn't seem like controversial art. So I remember when I lived in Philadelphia, the Love sculpture was actually fairly controversial when it was plopped in the center of the square near City Hall. And it doesn't feel controversial at all today, but I believe that it showed up around the times where we had the AIDS crisis and we were having some significant public discussions about homosexuality and AIDS epidemic and how people caught it. And this was one artist's attempt to really walk through all of that stuff and say, look, we as human beings want to send a different message. This is about more of a core value. But that was very controversial at the time, right? Whether they would even keep that statue.
Yeah, and public art is oftentimes controversial, right? And like I said, you can just look to the letters to the editor in the paper. There are usually public processes. There's usually particularly if something's going to go in public space, there's usually a lot of conversation around it. And invariably, people are upset. There's actually a piece of public art not too far from where I live, and some people love it and some people hate it and some people just don't know what it is. But I think, that's always going to be the way it is with public art. And, again, meaning can change over time. Things that are super controversial like that then become, a real symbol of the city itself, and everyone loves it and everybody forgets that it was controversial at the time, right? That happens a lot.
Well, just think about, we're in the Washington, D.C. area. Just think about the recent Martin Luther King memorial. Think about the Vietnam War Memorial. These were very controversial public sculptures and displays at the time that they were put up. In fact, they still are. So, people will continue to have conversations around art and how they make, how it makes them feel and whether they like it or whether they don't. But going back to one of our I think our core messages as part of this discussion, having those discussions are valuable. Sharing ideas and feelings are valuable. Allowing people to public discuss how art makes them feel is part of our culture. And so we want to continue to support that. And so public art can be controversial, and that's not a bad thing. It's okay to have something like that starts a discussion among people who have different viewpoints, because we learn from different people and their viewpoints.
I think that's right. And I think, we will see how this plays out. I mean, this one is supremely interesting because it is so incredibly public. And because the Fearless Girl was such a, internationally viewed piece of art and discussed piece of art, that this dispute, which under normal circumstances might have been a lot quieter, we now are sort of in the middle of it, right? And so, and I think even the mayor of New York has came out and said something about how, men upset by the placement of women, is exactly why we need Fearless Girl, right? That's the point. And so I think, it will be interesting to see if this fades away, or if it becomes a litigated battle, or if there is some kind of compromise that comes in here. But certainly we'll keep watching it, because it definitely, if this goes into litigation, it definitely is going to test the limits of our case law on VARA, on copyright derivative works, and also I think have some First Amendment implications as well. So we'll see.
Right. So, as you said, not litigated yet, but may go to litigation at some point in the future.
Yeah.
So I will leave our listeners with this. Remember Frank Lloyd Wright, a very famous architect, also thought of himself as an artist, and in fact is well known for going into his buildings and designing the furniture as well. And he would go back into the building sometimes when his customers were not there. And if they moved furniture around, he would actually move it back to the place that it was designed to be put.
Yes,
So
artists
that is
caring
an
about the meaning has not
extreme
changed.
example.
Yeah.
But this is not unknown among artists. They can be very particular. So, well, this is a great topic, Jennifer. As you said, we'll continue to watch it unfold and see whether these copyright issues and the moral rights issues actually have legs and become part of a real live litigation. Thanks to our listeners for joining us. You can also find us on blogging on our decodingip.com blog. You can follow us on Twitter at decodingip. My Twitter account is Antigone Payton. Jennifer, you also have a Twitter account?
Yeah, I'm at jsansatkins.
And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.